Imagine a country waking up one morning to find every ship heading to its ports has been turned around. No oil, no grain, no weapons, no medical supplies. The country hasn't been invaded. Not a single bomb has fallen, but the clock is already ticking. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a naval blockade works, why it's one of the most feared weapons a military can use, and why the nation's caught inside one fight so desperately to break out. Maritime shipping carries approximately 80% of global trade by volume, according to the World Bank's 2021 figures. That single statistic explains why cutting off a coastline can be just as devastating as any land battle. A blockade doesn't destroy a country, it starves it. So what actually is a naval blockade? Strip away the strategy and the legal language, and it's this: a fleet of warships positioned to intercept and turn back any vessel trying to reach an enemy's coastline. No ships get in, no ships get out. Trade, fuel, food, spare parts, weapons, reinforcements, all of it stopped cold before it ever reaches shore. The first recorded use of this strategy goes back to the Peloponnesian War between 431 and 404 BC, when the Athenian fleet blockaded the ports of Megara. The weapon is ancient, but the way it's run has gotten dramatically more complex. Now here's where most people's understanding of blockades goes wrong. A blockade isn't just parking ships in front of a harbour. There are two very different ways to enforce one, and the choice between them defines the entire campaign. The first is a close blockade. Ships hug the enemy coastline directly, patrolling right at the harbour entrances. Nothing gets through without being physically intercepted. It's aggressive and visible, but it also puts your ships in range of shore defences, mines, and submarine attack. The risk to the blockading fleet is real. The second method is a distant blockade. Instead of sitting off the enemy coast, you seize control of key maritime choke points, the narrow straits and sea lanes that all traffic must pass through to reach the enemy at all. Ships are intercepted further out, far from shore-based threats. The British Royal Navy used this exact approach during World War I, controlling the English Channel to the south and the gap between Scotland and Norway to the north, sealing Germany's access to the open ocean without exposing their fleet unnecessarily. Running a blockade requires patrol lines, ships spread across wide stretches of open water in coordinated coverage zones. When a vessel is intercepted, crews board and inspect it. This is where the legal questions get thorny. Neutral countries have the right to trade freely in peacetime, but during a declared conflict, blockading powers can seize goods classified as contraband, military supplies, weapons, and materials that directly support the enemy's war effort. The problem is that the line between civilian goods and military contraband has always been contested. Food feeds soldiers too. Fuel runs tanks as well as fishing boats. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides a legal framework for how blockades should be conducted, but legal scholars continue to debate where the boundaries actually sit, especially when civilian populations bear the heaviest coast. Now look at the history, because that's where the real mechanics become visible. The British blockade of Napoleonic France stretched across decades of the early 1800s. Britain used its naval dominance to choke French trade and keep European allies of France from receiving supplies by sea. It didn't end Napoleon alone, but it drained French resources continuously and forced strategic decisions that ultimately cost him. The Allied blockade of Germany during World War I, running from 1914 to 1918, is arguably the most consequential example in modern history. The British Navy sealed Germany off from Atlantic trade. Over the course of the war, German imports collapsed. Food shortages spread across the civilian population. Industrial production fell as raw materials dried up. By 1918, with the army exhausted and the home front crumbling from hunger and deprivation, Germany's war effort buckled. The blockade didn't win the war by itself, but it tore the foundation out from under the German state and played a direct role in the collapse that ended the fighting. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 introduced the world to a new version of this tool. The United States government deliberately avoided calling it a blockade. Under international law, a blockade is technically an act of war, and instead declared a quarantine around Cuba to stop Soviet ships carrying missiles to the island. United States Navy vessels formed a line across the Atlantic approaches to Cuba, with orders to intercept and turn back any ship carrying offensive military equipment. The standoff lasted 13 days. Soviet ships ultimately turned around. The legal rebranding as a quarantine rather than a blockade was a deliberate move to avoid triggering a formal declaration of war while still applying maximum maritime pressure. So what does a country do when it finds itself on the inside of one? The most direct answer is blockade running, using fast, low-profile ships to slip through the patrol lines at night or in bad weather. It works to a degree, but the risks are high and the volume's small. You can't feed a nation on smuggled shipments. A more systematic approach is rerouting supply through neutral third parties. If a neutral country borders your enemy, goods can be shipped to that neutral port legally and then moved overland. Germany tried this in World War I, routing supplies through neighbouring neutral countries. The Allies responded by extending their contraband controls and pressuring neutral nations not to re-export goods to German territory. Building overland supply alternatives, railways, roads, pipelines, is the long-term structural answer. It removes dependency on sea routes entirely, but it takes time and resources a blockaded nation may not have. The final option is military or diplomatic escalation. Either break the blockade by force, attacking the blockading fleet directly, or force a diplomatic resolution that lifts it. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended this way. The Soviet Union stepped back, and the quarantine ended. Blockades remain active today. The blockade of the Gaza Strip, in place since 2007, has generated ongoing international debate, with a United Nations report from 2023 noting that over 70% of Gaza's population depends on humanitarian aid. Freedom of navigation disputes in the South China Sea continue to put naval pressure tactics at the center of international relations. The core logic of a naval blockade hasn't changed since the Athenians sailed to Megara. Control the water, control the supply lines, control what a country can survive on. It's not a dramatic weapon, it's a patient one. And patience, applied with enough naval power, can bring down governments without a single soldier crossing a border.